Hello, and good afternoon if you're watching from here in the United States, and good day and good morning if you're tuning in from Australia. I'm Charles Edel, Senior Advisor and Australia Chair here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to this discussion of the state of Australia-China relations and whether or not we're seeing a shift from a freeze to a thaw. Now, for a little background context, over the last several years, Australia's relationship with China has deteriorated, and it's done so rather swiftly. But it wasn't that long ago that Australians had a much rosier view of China. In 2014, Xi Jinping visited Australia and talked about an era of friendship, goodwill, and prosperity. The last part mattered a lot. From 2009 to 2019, Australian exports to China tripled to $110 billion per year, accounting for nearly 40% of Australian exports. As China grew, as it modernized, Australia grew wealthy. But what was once a mutually beneficial economic and commercial partnership took a turn as China began to seek more influence and control in Australian society and domestic affairs. The Chinese government sought to influence the Chinese diaspora in Australia. It has attempted to silence debate about China on university campuses. It subjected Australia to economic coercion and explored setting up Chinese naval bases within striking distance of Australia. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Australian public opinion has shifted in response to these actions, with only 12% of Australians now saying that they trust China somewhat or a great deal. And that represents a 40-point drop over just the past 4 years, according to Lowy Institute polling. Australia's new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, promised that while he would change the new Labour government's tone and rhetoric towards China, he would not change the direction of Australia's China policies. Perhaps as an indication of a slight thaw, after having had no high-level contact between China and Australia for nearly 5 years, the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Trade Minister have all met with their Chinese counterparts in recent months. Now, what does this slow motion reset, if we can call it that, between Beijing and Canberra mean in practice? Are there limitations to it? And what does it mean for Australia's foreign policy, its defense strategy, and its trade relations? To answer these questions, please join us, or you are joining us, I should say rather, for this great discussion with three leading observers of Australian-Chinese relations, Justin Bassey, Richard McGregor, and Amy Bagia. Richard McGregor is a senior fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute in Sydney and a senior associate of the Freeman Chair here at CSIS. Richard is a former Beijing and Washington bureau chief for the FT and the author of numerous books on East Asia. His most recent book, Xi Jinping, The Backlash, was published by Penguin Australia as a Lowy Institute paper in August 2019. His book on Sino-Japanese relations, Asia's Reckoning, won the Prime Minister of Australia's Literary Award for Nonfiction, and his book, The Party, on the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party, has been translated into 7 languages and was chosen by the Asia Society as their best book of the year. Justin Bassey is the executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. From June 2019 to March 2022, he was chief of staff to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women, Senator the Honorable Marise Payne. Immediately prior to this, Justin was the Cyber Intelligence Mission Manager at the Office of National Intelligence, where he led the integration of cybersecurity and critical technologies across the national intelligence community in Australia. From September 2015 to August 2018, Justin was the National Security Advisor to then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. He led the team advising the PM and cabinet ministers on Australia's national security, defense, and international relations. Prior to that, Justin spent over 10 years in the Australian Public Service, including in the intelligence community for the Office of National Assessments and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, where he had responsibility for cybersecurity policy. Last but certainly not least, we're joined by Amy Bagia. Amy recently left her position on the Biden-Harris administration's National Security Council as the Director for Countering Foreign Malign Influence and Information Integrity. Prior to her time at the White House, Amy worked in various positions within the U.S. intelligence community, including as a senior director in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She's also held positions as a senior intelligence advisor, an executive assistant to the Director of National Intelligence, the Deputy Director of National Intelligence, and as a speechwriter for the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Prior to joining ODNI, I should say, Amy worked at both the State Departments and the Central Intelligence Agency. She and her family recently relocated from Washington to Melbourne and she's currently working as an associate vice president of a Trans-Pacific analytic consulting firm. As you can tell, we have a terrific lineup of speakers here, and I'd like to get right into some of the issues because there are many here. Richard, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it over to you first. And I was hoping that for our audience, but just in general, you could give us a bit of a scene setter, what we think of Australia's relationship with China, and can you really give us a sense of how we got to where we are today?
Yes, well, as you say, said in the introduction, Australia's relations with China, I guess, hit a peak in about 2014 when Xi Jinping addressed both houses of parliament. The sort of differences we had, I think, were sort of camouflaged or put aside at that time. If you look at opportunity and risk, at that stage, it was all opportunity. Now, that changed, I guess, in the way of, Hemingway's definition of bankruptcy, slowly then rapidly. I moved back to Australia about 5 years ago, and it was astounding how many points of difference were in the newspapers every day between Australia and China. Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, foreign interference, economic coercion. In Australian dollars, directed about 20 billion or 15 billion US dollars, 10% of total trade, and really designed to do two things, I think. Either Australia would fold in response to this pressure, and that would be a victory for China, or secondly, Australia would suffer great pain, economic pain, and that would be an example for others not to take the kind of approach that we did. And we sort of stayed in that deep freeze with the economic coercion measures really from about May 2020. So what's happened then in the last 12 months where we do have a slight thaw? Why has the relationship, improved at the margins? First of all, there's a new government that always allows both sides to have a change in approach, particularly as this government has said it's going to conduct its diplomacy differently. Secondly, the coercion tactics failed. Australia didn't pay much of a cost. If you're a winemaker or you sell lobsters, yes, you suffered, your business suffered greatly. But in aggregate, Australia's economic relationship with China has continued to be, very healthy. And that's one of the fascinating things about the dispute so far is that both sides during this time, 3 years, tried to diversify their trading relationship, and actually both sides failed. Now, it's not really surprising. We can't change our comparative advantage quickly. And in the short run, diversification actually has been it's a lofty goal, an important goal, but a bit of a chimera. So that's, so China's campaign failed. The trade relationship has continued to prosper to the benefit of both parties. It's not unlike, frankly, what happened in South Korea after China used the same tactics there after the South Koreans agreed to install the anti-missile shield. In that case, some South Korean companies suffered greatly, but the overall relationship, trade relationship continued to prosper because China doesn't do self-harm. In our case, they've continued to import Australian commodities. In South Korea's case, inputs into the electronics industry. Now, I want to say that I think perversely the Ukraine war has helped. That elevated the strategic importance of commodity exporters. And, Australia is, frankly, like Russia to Germany in certain commodities for China. 70% of iron ore imports, 50% of LNG imports, 95% of wool imports. We are exporting records amount of wheat to China now. That's partly because of Ukraine as well. And so occasionally when you're so intertwined with another country in that respect, you've got to check in with them. And that's what China is doing. Finally, this is not just about Australia. Naturally, Australians see it through that prism. But as we all know, China is doing a diplomatic recalibration of sorts, not a reset, by the way, Charles. We're not allowed to use that word. It's not a reset. That's one of the banned words in Australia-China relations at the moment. But look at China in Europe. The most fascinating part of this, it's not the subject of today's discussion, is what China is trying to do to get out of the hole it's in on Russia, so-called peace plan. We're going to see more about that in coming days. So Australia is part of that as well. It was though China didn't care previously that its image had fallen into a hole in multiple advanced industrialized countries. It now appears they think they have to do something about that. And on the final point, and other panelists might be speaking about this, we're having started to talk together again, we're starting to see the limits of the rapprochement, I think, pretty obviously. Now, the AUKUS announcement in March sometime or later is going to test that. But I think even little things that I've noticed, for example, Chinese students are back in person on Australian campuses. So we're starting to get incidents again where posters critical of the Chinese government are being ripped down by Chinese students. All these sorts of what look like smaller things, but which are exemplary of, a difference in values and interests are going to start popping up in the sort of political and media narrative again. And of course, US and China relations are very important. The balloon has thrown them off course again as well. And I think the US-China relationship and how that develops will affect how Australia-China relations develops and is one of the limits or caps on how much our relations are going to improve. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Justin, I want to stay a little bit, if you don't mind, on the prehistory before we get to the present, because this not reset, I take your words of this recalibration is, I believe, the term of art we're now using, didn't come out of nowhere, because when there was more recognition of the challenge, the Australian government had responded over a number of years in a number of different ways. And Justin, as someone who's a key player in Canberra, inside of government during this recalibration 1.0 period, I was hoping you could both kind of walk us through how Canberra responded, and perhaps then flip and talk a little bit about what you think the current government is attempting to achieve with this so-called recalibration. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie, and good to be with Richard and Amy. I enjoyed listening to Richard then, and as usual, agree with basically everything he said. One, I think perhaps nuance between us probably would be the significance of the call for the COVID inquiry, which was publicly very significant, of course. I think the pressure was on from as early as 2016 and particularly in 2017 from a range of sectors, notwithstanding there might not have been specific trade measures. But in terms of how Canberra responded, I think on the whole, Charlie, Canberra responded very well. You have to remember that the context at the time, and it's easy to forget, but in 2016, if we're using 2015, 2016 as the beginning of the original reset, and not so much a ban of the word reset for me, but just a recognition that we've gone through the reset. So in my view, we were in not a great place 2015. We needed a form of reset. We've done that. And now whether it's a recalibration or a stabilization, whatever word you want to use. But in the context of 2016, the peak issue, or the issue at the time that was the number one priority, was ISIL. ISIL was still at its peak. And so all the issues that were being seen and were being addressed around 2016 were in the context of the government having to put their primary focus on countering terrorism. So it was relatively proactive. While, yes, a little bit slow in some areas, it was still relatively proactive. But we needed to be, or Australia needed to be. And the reason that we, I think, saw a bit of a change around that time was that instead of it being one issue at a time and a salami slicing of core strategic issues, we faced a confluence of events from vulnerabilities around critical infrastructure and critical technologies to cyber intrusions becoming identified, to the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal case in relation to the South China Sea, to foreign interference becoming a thing that simply wasn't before, it didn't even exist in terms of a law or policy, and then economic coercion. So what we saw at that time, Charlie, in my view, was a transition from economic prosperity being the government and the establishment's core priority to security becoming the priority. And that happened despite some sectors. The response was to push past those across sectors saying, don't risk the good economic times. A key to that success was bipartisanship. It was also realizing, and this goes to one of Richard's points, that there was no longer an ability to say, we're going to restrict the decisions that we're going to make. We're going to make one decision that's important here, and then we're going to have a bit of a break for 6 months. You couldn't just say, well, we'll strengthen the foreign investment rules and we're going to leave it. You couldn't just make the 5G decision and say there won't be another decision again. We couldn't just introduce the countering foreign interference laws and say there will be no more new laws. There will always be another issue. There will always be another decision to make. And that's what eventually led to both AUKUS and the Defence Strategic Review, both responding to China. We would have neither AUKUS nor the DSR without China's rise. What we also saw, Charlie, was national resilience and the importance of resilience. And I think it surprised many, even in Australia and abroad. But while it's probably felt a long time, and it has been a long time for many sectors, it's really only been 5 years. So the key now, coming to today, is that we've got to maintain that resilience. We can't afford to say, well, we've done that for 5 years, so that's enough. We can go back to some type of pre-2016 situation. So it was very interesting to see Prime Minister Albanese earlier this week provide an address to the National Press Club, where he espoused the principle that economic sovereignty is national security. And in my view, it's an important distinction from the old economic prosperity, where if an initiative could make you a buck, then it was automatically a good thing, and that trumped security. So the key that he's placing there on sovereignty is important because sovereignty can't be compromised. And the government's two-track approach of having a measured tone, not poking anyone in the eye, while not changing policy, has reaped dividends. Got to give the government credit for being able to change the tone while not changing government policy. It's paid dividends in relation to the China relationship, where ministers are engaging again, which is very good. It's also been well received in our region. Southeast Asia doesn't really like any tension or great power conflict, so they have what we refer to, I suppose, as the new non-aligned movement has received it well. But and I think there is a but. Our friends in Washington, Tokyo, Delhi, etc., are watching. They're keen to know whether this two-track approach is actually a long-term, is a feasible one in the long term. So if I could just mention 3 issues that I think we need to watch around all that. One is trade policy, that we must not go back to where trade policy was viewed as separate to national security policy. And so 2 issues around trade, the ongoing WTO cases around wine and barley, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In my view, we can't afford to drop the WTO cases or allow negotiations for China into the TPP at the moment, because that would be, in my view, effectively a reinforcement that economic coercion works. There has to be some type of standard setting first before any of those things were to happen. And if they were to happen, Charlie, around the WTO cases being dropped or TPP being negotiated, in my view, the fact that the government has done so well not to change policy, well, that would then change, And the question then in other capitals will be, well, if that area of policy is flexible, what other areas are flexible? The second one is the importance of narrative. We've got to be able to deal with both capabilities and narrative at the same time, two sides of the same coin. We've got the DSR and AUKUS decisions coming out soon, high-end military capabilities. We need to be able to explain why we need to invest in them. If we don't get that social license, if we don't explain why we need those capabilities, then the announcements, which will be excellent in my view, won't come to fruition over time. So is that going to be compatible with the current China policy? And thirdly, as I alluded to earlier, the importance of bipartisanship. This was key to Australia's success, and it remains so. We've watched on from Canberra in relation to what's happened with Russia and the US. In my view, the arguments over whether there was an impact on the 2016 election or not, far more important to that, in my view, is what it's done to the society in the US. It's still 7 years on. There's partisanship, there's division, there's disruption, and that's what Russia wants. And we've seen it similarly in relation to Canada with the leak of the Intel report. So it will be important that the Canadian opposition, of course, hold the government to account and ask questions, but don't do China's bidding for them and don't allow a split and a division. And so it will be the same here. Bipartisanship is not a matter of falling into line. It's not a matter of saying yes, sir, no, sir. It's a matter of still holding to account, but not bidding for doing China or Russia's bidding. And it also shows why collective narrative, collective action is so important.
Thanks, Justin. Really appreciated kind of the scan of what happened, but also kind of the understanding, or at least your tea leaf reading on where we are, but what things in particular to watch as we move forward, because of course we're in a state of flux on relations, not only in Canberra, but in Washington as well, with Beijing balloons notwithstanding. And Amy, as someone who knows Australia quite well, as someone who's watched Australia, but as someone who has just moved back to Australia, one of the things I would ask of you is kind of taking this conversation for a second outside of the simple two-player framework, right? Not just China and Australia, but as Justin just said, Australia's friends are also watching what's happening here. And I guess if we talk particularly, I'm thinking about your old perch when you were on the NSC. Can you just give a sense about why Washington has paid just so much attention to this dynamic between Beijing and Canberra? And, more specifically, I guess, from a governmental perspective, why did what Canberra undertook matter, or did it matter from kind of a Washington viewpoint?
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. And again, thanks for inviting me into this conversation today. Aside, two incredible colleagues whose work I have long admired. So, I'm grateful to be here. And I think, I come at this problem particularly through the lens of foreign interference, where I think, some, particularly in Australia, will say Australians should be concerned about following US policy blindly with regard to China. And I'd say that in the foreign interference space and sort of on emerging technology and critical technology, Australia's actually been really at the leading edge, and our partnership, which, in my view, is deeper now than it has ever been. The Australians really led the way. And in fact, when I was in government making decisions about the Biden-Harris policy on foreign interference, I looked to my Australian colleagues and counterparts to sort of both attempt to emulate some of the good work they'd done and draw lessons learned. Because, as Justin mentioned, the conversation is pretty politicized in the United States. And so we had some particular landmines to navigate. And I think that one of the greatest benefits to our partnership on foreign interference is that when we do it together, it's really about preserving democracy, preserving our sovereignty, and upholding our values. And if we can message that together, it is far more resonant than if we do it just as a single country that has, frankly, a pretty complex discourse on the issue. And I would say that, hallmark of the Biden-Harris administration has been really on reinvesting in our multilateralism. And that, to me, starts at the heart of our relationship with Australia, for example, with our Five Eyes partners. And so on many issues, I think it is important that we are in lockstep. But on this issue in particular, as China has really focused its ire on Australia in ways that as the United States we've not experienced, we have a lot of lessons to learn. And so ensuring that we continue to be aligned is both in our interests at a macro level, but it is also, I think, in our interest to ensure that adversaries like Russia and China don't divide these multilateral and bilateral alliances, which are one of the core pillars of our strength as democracies.
Amy, just a quick follow-up question for you. Obviously, this was your day job. This is what you handled. You interfaced with Justin and others fairly regularly. But I'm curious, kind of when you made the rounds in Washington, how deep was the knowledge? That's true. I'm asking about the administration, but also up on the Hill about what Australia was reckoning with, where their national debate was. The four of us track this issue. I'm curious from your viewpoint, how well known the various particulars of this case were.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there was a pretty deep knowledge across particular sectors who were tracking these issues. I will say, sort of across the board on foreign interference, there was a lot of education to be done, and that is still an ongoing challenge. And in particular, I think the Trump administration had done a really good job of highlighting elements of the foreign interference problem, particularly in critical and emerging technologies. But what we found, I think, that was fairly new and unique was the targeting of sort of diaspora communities, what we are calling, and I think, sort of common parlance now, transnational repression, and how the foreign interference at the sort of bleeding edge of cutting technology is a part of a spectrum of activities that really threaten the integrity of our democratic institutions and frankly, our people. And so that conversation was not as well developed. And I think it was a bit of an education initiative for us to sort of talk about it more holistically. And I think there was a bit of work to repair what had been such a divisive conversation for so many. And so in many respects, as Justin said, we were trying to maintain what were largely really effective policies and change the tone a little bit domestically so that we could have a more thoughtful and frankly, a more precise conversation about these threats.
Yeah, it's really useful, actually, and a really important element of this conversation. Every time we talk about this for two, very multicultural societies who take great pride in that, it's really important to think about how this affects them, how we talk about this. Richard, I know that you've run several events. You kind of are in constant conversation with various communities around Australia. I'd just like to say that, this is a question I'm going to toss your way first, but let me just kind of, for everyone who's watching, there are roughly 1.2 million Australians who claim Chinese ancestry. That's nearly 5% of Australia's population. Can you, Richard, I'll go to you first on this, give us a sense of how diplomatic tensions between Canberra and Beijing have played out within this particular community? But then also, and I'm teeing this question up for Justin and Amy as well, because Australia was first off the mark in many ways for recognizing this. What are the lessons that we might want to draw out about how to protect members of our own community as we deal with kind of geopolitical tension? So, Richard, first, your thoughts, what you're hearing, particularly within ethnic communities within Australia, about how these tensions play out.
This is a really difficult issue and with no easy answer to it in a multicultural country like Australia. I think the figure is, I was looking at it even yesterday, even higher, probably 6-7% with Chinese ancestry of some kind. And obviously that's from many different countries, not just China itself, except the more recent waves have been overwhelmingly from the mainland. It's a diverse community. Some have been here for decades, even more than a century. Others arrived last year, rich, poor, middle class. I think they vote in different ways. And of course, quite a number of them, Christians and the like, quite religious community and so forth. So it's very diverse. There's no such thing as a Chinese, single Chinese view, just as there's no such thing as a single Chinese vote, if you like, in elections. But one point I will make, and this is a political point, and I think it's interesting and on many different levels. Australian elections are always close. The current government has a majority of about 2 or 3 seats. Now that wouldn't swing back to the coalition if they were to lose that majority, because we have many independents now. But nonetheless, all elections are close. And one of the most amazing things that happened in the last election, and this, by the way, has been acknowledged quite openly, this is not a partisan point, by both the reviews of the election, public reviews of the election by the head of the Labor Party and also the Liberal Party, is that seats in Sydney and Melbourne with large Chinese Australian populations swung at a much greater, by a much greater amount to Labor Party from the Liberals. So about 4 seats, 3 in Melbourne, 3 in Sydney, 1 in Melbourne. And this is interesting as I said, on many levels, because politicians will take notice of many things, but they will take notice most of all about how people vote and what happens in elections. And you've seen since then people, Peter Dutton and the like, James Patterson, who are prominent in the Liberal Party, saying they need to recalibrate how they talk about Chinese Australians. But I don't think it's as simple as that, because there are going to be many difficult issues we still have to talk about. We're going to have many difficult issues to talk about in relation to China and the CCP and the like, be it foreign interference or just foreign policy or geopolitics generally. And I still don't think we've worked out a way how to do this. Because there are some Chinese Australians, for all manner of reasons, who are going to be upset about critical comments about China. Now, our problem is that the CCP, as my friend John Garno once put it, has collapsed the categories between the CCP and China. They become a single entity, and that's how it ends up. That's can be bad in the way that we behave it. You have headlines which just say Chinese or China, and it mightn't be that. It's very hard in political debate in a democracy for us to distinguish between Chinese people and the Chinese party state. So politicians are going to talk about China more sensitively. I personally think that's a good thing. The head of the Labor Party said the Chinese Australians thought that the previous government's rhetoric had licensed racism. I'm not going to comment on that. That's what he said. But I think we are a long way from working out how to handle this in our own democracies.
I would just note, we had a conversation specifically about foreign interference back in August, and we had John Fitzgerald on, and just kind of following up on Richard's very good point, for those who are trying to think about how you can do this responsibly, how you can make sure those actually divisions exist, that Chinese and Chinese people are not the same thing as the Chinese government or the CCP or the United Front Work Department. I would just, anyone who's watching, I would commend you to Professor Fitzgerald's excellent report, Mind Your Tongue, that ASPE put out about how you think and how you categorize and how you speak about these. But let me actually toss it Amy's way too here about kind of extrapolating out a little bit further, not about the electoral districts and suburbs, which matter enormously, as Richard said, but when we think about protecting our own communities within Australia, within the United States, what kind of lessons do you begin to draw out kind of from Australia's initial attempts here to make sure that we're doing this, sensitively, but also to make sure that we are absolutely confronting foreign interference in our own communities? Amy.
Yeah, thanks. I think we, when I was still at the National Security Council, really did try and take a page out of Australia's book in the framing of this conversation around resilience. So trying to build a resilient democracy and resilient communities. I think that is really at the core of what this work is supposed to be about. Now, I think in practice, it's pretty difficult to execute. And I think one area where the United States and Australia have a slightly different approach is in the naming and defining of the problem. And so, you've heard Home Affairs Minister O'Neill spoke, I believe it was just last week, and Secretary General Burgess just spoke, giving his national security threat briefing. And, in both of those sort of really high profile public remarks, neither named the Chinese government, specifically the PRC. And in defining the threat, they really use sort of actor agnostic language. That is an approach we adopted in the Biden and Harris administration, particularly for public engagement. But what we found is when you actually went into communities and tried to arm them with information, not just how to sort of understand that you may be a target, how to identify when you are being targeted, but then how to take steps to actually protect yourself, we found that vague got us almost nowhere, that we needed to be specific, we needed to be precise. It required sort of careful language and careful engagement, trusted interlocutors. But in the end, we had to be very clear about where that threat was emanating from and how they would experience it. And so on this issue, particularly when it comes to protecting the communities who rightfully hold sort of deep connections and deep alliance with their heritage and with their home country and have many connections back to their country of origin, we need to be thoughtful about how we talk about it, but specific enough for them to understand that they really are being targeted and that we're trying to help protect them from what is, if not illegal behavior, absolutely unacceptable behavior.
Justin, I'd like to get your thoughts on this too, kind of shaping the government kind of reactions, what the Department of Home Affairs has done. But I also, just because I do want to key into something that you had said earlier about kind of your things to watch, and particularly on the trade front. Let me throw a second question out your way too. The Australian government recently approved $1 billion stake by the Chinese state-owned enterprise Baowu Steel Group in Rio Tinto's Western Range iron ore projects. I'm curious how you interpret this and whether or not you think this is a signal of back to business as usual or a special exemption or something else altogether.
Thanks, Charlie. I can be quick on the on both, but on the lessons around communities and language, I really can't improve on what both Richard and Amy said. I think they nailed it, and you're all right. The two Johns who you mentioned are really excellent on this. John Fitzgerald's work, really worth reading. The importance of language, and it's tough. It's particularly for politicians who are asked questions on the go, always having to be 100% right on every single word is very, very tough. And perhaps me included, we can be a bit harsh at times on them, but language is vital. We've got to make sure that we are really focused on the actions of the government, the actions of the regime, that we're making that clear. But the point that was made, I think, by Amy, or maybe by Richard, that the CCP has collapsed the distinction. That's their aim, and so when they make sure their narrative is consistent, that whenever an Australian government or US government says something about their actions, whether it's a weather balloon, a hypersonic missile test, encroachment in the South China Sea, whatever it is, the CCP is able to turn it into an anti-China issue. And we, at times, I think, do facilitate and enable that argument. In part, it goes to Amy's point, again, really tricky. Whether it be her description of the Biden administration's initial attempts to be country agnostic all the time, or the current government's two-track approach of measured time. It is very important. I'm a big believer in being country agnostic. Your laws and policies do need to have a level of country agnostic context with them. It's vital. But transparency in bringing the public along with you is just as important. So you've got to meet that balance. And it's important also for this reason that while there is an absolute need for politicians, the media, people like us to mind our language and to not attack or blame communities, we also have to recognize that there's a protection of those communities on the other side as well, that where people in those communities do have the courage to speak up, we've got to support that. And so if it's whether it be the Uyghur community or someone wanting to protest about the lack of what's going on in Hong Kong, whatever it is, that part of our language and part of what governments do has to be to protect that and not allow Beijing censorship to come to a country like Australia. What the Chinese Communist Party does better than any is use technology. Amy mentioned transnational repression. I think this is of vital importance and more important, excuse me, than what our governments and agencies really comprehend at the moment, is the use of technology to repress diaspora individuals or community groups as a whole. And they are using technology in a way that at the moment governments and agencies aren't quite sure who has the remit. And we've had it here at ASPI, well-known ASPI fellow Vicky Xu constantly faces abuse online, where people are trying to get her to commit suicide. And there is just not the responsibilities in place to actually understand where does Vicky go for support. So I think that there are two sides to that coin. In terms of the trade question, can you remind me? I've forgotten what the trade. Oh, the investment. The investment. Really quickly, I always tend to talk too long. There were a series of strengthenings to our investment screening mechanisms following the Darwin port lease that sort of hit the system like a ton of bricks, and it was there were a series of vulnerabilities there, and they were addressed over a period of time. The key for me, without being able to go tell you about anything specific about this most recent case, the key for me, whether it be infrastructure or technology or minerals, is the word critical, Charlie. We have to work out that what technology, what infrastructure, what minerals are critical to our needs, and what has an impact on national security and our sovereignty. And that's where the threshold is. It shouldn't be a case that we are saying we can't allow our universities or businesses to engage with China on any of these aspects. But we need to work out what's critical. And I think an important part of this most recent one is that it didn't slip through the FERB cracks that existed. Part of the problem with Darwin Port all those years ago is that it didn't actually meet the threshold for review. So here, I think public should have a level of reassurance where there is a system in place and that system is followed. And that there isn't a political decision to unwind whatever that process is. And not to say that improvements shouldn't always be made. We're going through a similar process with the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. Even if laws are perfect when they're first made, 3, 5, 10 years on, it needs constant review.
Great. Richard, I know you've written on trade recently, but let me also toss your way as you kind of respond on the trade part too. I want to make sure that we take some questions here. And one of my colleagues here at CSIS, Gerard DePippo, asked, for your read, for kind of all of your reads, have the Chinese actually relented on their coercive measures? Or are we just having, sweeter words coming out of Beijing, less wolf, more honeybird at this point? How much do you read what's happening in Beijing as understanding that what they were doing was ineffectual politically, and as you said, was costly for them? So trade in kind of what Beijing is doing right now. Thanks, Richard.
Yes, well, they definitely have not relented because basically all of the restrictions in one form or another are in place. I think they've allowed a few red lobsters and a few shipments of coal to go in, but that's really at the margins. I think China is quite good at opening the door a little way and making it look like they're flinging them wide open. South Korea these days still suffers under or is hurt by some of the measures taken back in 2016. And I think the ones against Australia, frankly, in one form or another will have an impact for many, many years. So no, they haven't, but some of the larger obstacles may be unwound, either if there's a deal or if Justin was talking about the cases go all the way through the WTO and there is a decision there. But I think, it worries me that Australians, I do believe, frankly, that the trade relationship is very valuable for us. I think that the foreign investment you talked about involving Baowu Steel, I think the government was quite right to approve that. We're going to face much bigger difficulties, and China has raised this a lot with us lately on other foreign investment issues, lithium, rare earths. Australia, I think, it exports about 50% of the world's lithium, or it produces 50% of the world's lithium. So we've got other countries, like-minded countries, Japan in particular, South Korea, Europe and the like, and the United States, of course, all coming to us to secure future supplies of critical minerals as an alternative to China. China will want to invest in the sector in Australia as well. So I think that's where the difficult foreign investment decisions will come.
Actually, talking about the kind of limitations of the Thaw, let me throw this question out for consideration too. This comes in from Bill Bishop, who I'm sure everyone here follows with the Cynicism newsletter, great China watcher. I mean, Bill had asked kind of all of you to scope out, do you think the Thaw is real? And what about kind of exacerbators of non-thawing, like the Solomon Islands? How much will that get in the way for other things that we're talking about here? I don't know who wants to start with that, but Justin, why don't you take us off on that one first?
I think that undoubtedly there's been improvement. The very fact that there was no ministerial engagement for years, and now there is ministerial engagement it shows an improvement, and it is good. But whether that means that there is a reset, as you should talk about at the beginning, I don't believe that's the case. I think Richard's point at the start was right, that we have to be able to show that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to I think, live with tension. The answer is not to try and work out how do we remove the tension, or how do we create a situation where we're walking on eggshells and we never say anything. I really think that the policy setting needs to be that the values between the two political systems and the activities that the Chinese Communist Party carries out means that we're not going to reach an alignment on our values or interests. And so we're going to have to live with tension. And hopefully that still means that we can talk through those differences. We still need to ensure that we can talk about the Australians who are arbitrarily detained in a completely disgraceful way. So there's always going to be the next issue. There's going to be the next flyovers over Taiwan. There's going to be the next issue in South China Sea. There's going to be the next issue across a range of issues, the next decision to make. So yes, improved relations, or as the foreign minister and defense minister talk about, stabilized relations, but there's not going to be an alignment on interests. We're going to have to live with and manage those tensions, ensuring that in doing so, we don't compromise on our interests. And that's going to be the key, that in all these decisions that are to be made, we need to focus on our long-term sovereignty.
Yeah, you're lighting us up that there are a million different directions we can go here. We haven't even started discussing Taiwan. We will before the hour is over. But Amy, wanted your impressions on this set of issues as well.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be perhaps the skeptic in the room and say a few things. I think first that, as the relationship with the United States sort of reaches new lows, I suppose, in recent memory, I think it makes sort of strategic sense for the Chinese government to try and recalibrate, both here in Australia, but also I think we've seen this in Europe as well. And so to the extent that they may be hedging some bets here, I think that's on the table. And then the other point that I would make is that, this is a pretty clever and learning adversary. And where I think the last few years of their aggressive approach has yielded very few dividends for them. They are recalibrating themselves. And one of the things that I've seen manifested in the United States that I think is relevant here is that, as we develop new laws and set new red lines for activities, they're extremely capable of acting then just below that threshold. And so I think there is a bit of a two-pronged approach. They are recalibrating in an attempt to sort of reset the relationship. I don't think that strategically changes their goals and sort of the bad behavior that they think they can get away with here in Australia and elsewhere. And I think that they have taken some lessons learned in the Russia-Ukraine context, where the United States, along with our close allies and partners, have reinvested in these multilateral relationships to great effect. And so if the PRC can divide some of these partnerships before they're really called upon in sort of perhaps a future contingency situation with regard to Taiwan, all the better. So I would say that we should take the warming of relations, the thaw, with great skepticism.
Let me actually, because the last two questions have started to kind of get us towards a particularly sensitive topic in discussions around Australia about Taiwan, as Australia sorts through its policy settings here. Richard, I'm going to come to you on this first because it was directly pinged towards you. This is your old colleague at the FT, Dimitri Sevastopoulos, who, number one, wants to know how many of the books on your bookshelf you've actually read. He's very impressed with it. But I think on a somewhat more serious note, had asked the question, and again, I'd be curious for all of your response, but Richard, you first, whether or not the Albanese government needs to have a public discussion about the role Australia would play in a US-China conflict over Taiwan.
Yes, well, we had a public discussion of sorts under the previous government, but Peter Dutton, I think, made some statements as Defence Minister, if I remember correctly, saying that it was unthinkable Australia would not be by America's side were there to be a conflict over Taiwan. But even Peter Dutton at that stage, he would say almost in the next breath that I don't want to change Australia's policy on Taiwan. He likes the status quo, so-called. The status quo, of course, is a very misleading term in Southeast Asia and Taiwan because it's dynamic and moving in China's favor. And that's probably, why we will start to have to talk more publicly, as Japan has, about what Australia might do. Now, it's my understanding, and I don't want to say too much about this because I'm not an insider in the system, that the Pentagon and the Defence Department or the Australian government haven't really done much or hadn't really done much joint contingency planning for Taiwan in recent years. But I think that's probably something that's under discussion now and under discussion with Japan. In other words, we haven't had our head buried in the sand about it, but I don't think the system has wanted to confront that, in part because it's such a sensitive issue with Taiwan. But I think the greater cooperation generally between the US, Japan, and Australia inevitably will have to discuss Taiwan in one form or another. And indeed, of course, the Philippines is doing right now. The Philippines, 40 minutes by air from Kaohsiung, and the Philippines have been discussing it in public as well.
Justin, please.
Charlie, yeah, I agree with you. I think it also shows why, as much as the Quad is, I love the Quad, and it's hugely important for the region, and the region is growing to understand, respect, and like the Quad more and more and more throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific for its positive perspectives. But I think it does show why the trilateral strategic dialogue, Australia, US, Japan, has to have a role, because that's the initial grouping that should be discussing the contingency. And the only other element, I suppose, from my perspective, I, as much as everyone here, whether it be Lowy or ASPI or other places, the debate of what's going to happen with cross-strait tensions is the big one. I still think that the CCP would far rather not have to do anything to unify which is why, in amongst all the arguments over similarities and differences with Russia's war in Ukraine, a big element that we should all be watching and are watching, and Beijing is watching, is the West's stamina. And so, if we're coming up to 1 year now, if we don't continue to provide support to Ukraine, and Putin wins over a period of time, well, that'll be music to the ears of the regime in Beijing, that they will feel that our view of democracies is correct. They're weak. They have no stamina. We just have to outlast them. So the more that we can hold on there is actually helps. And then there are, of course, our own decisions around AUKUS and DSR that adds to deterrence, which we've perhaps had not put as much emphasis on over the previous 20 years. Deterrence is going to continue to be the most important aspect to our strategy.
Look, let me just apologize because I know that we actually have to conclude somewhat shortly, but this is a really rich conversation. We actually have 3 world-leading experts here, and I just want to note that we could keep going for quite a while here. We've covered trade, we've talked about diaspora communities, we talked about foreign influence, we've talked about deterrence, we've talked about Quad, we've talked about our language. There's a lot of issues. This is a very rich conversation here. And I think I'd like to conclude by asking each of our panelists to just kind of do a little bit of predictive forecasting work on what should we expect to happen next in the Australia-China relationship. What are we looking for? Justin, you raised this point earlier in our conversation. Just how sustainable is this a new approach, and what are, as Richard had said, kind of the limits of that reset? So let me kind of turn it over to Amy first to kind of take us down the road here, but about where you think things are likely to evolve to next. Amy.
Sure, I say start with the pessimist first. Look, I think the trajectory of the relationship is not a good one. I'm perhaps less sanguine than most. And I think, let's take, for example, the microcosmic example of TikTok and the debate in Washington right now, and sort of this growing recognition that, the information operations and control of the information environment in a lead up to a contingency in Taiwan, for example, is essential. And so we can't presume that the preparation of the battle space is not happening as we speak. And so I think that over time, the conversation may start like something as it has in the US about TikTok, and the CCP's ability to sort of shape opinions in this sort of covert and coercive, quiet way. And that's going to snowball, and it's going to be, it will lead to a broader recognition that there are clearly divergent values here, and that the Chinese government's goal is to, dissuade the United States as allies from joining us in whatever comes next. And I don't think that that's something that the Australian government, and I don't think it's something the Australian people in the long run would want.
Richard, I'm reminded of something that you had written not that long ago about kind of competition across increasing and indeed every field of endeavor, and what that actually looks like then from a government and then a political perspective. But again, Richard, what do you think specifically, kind of not on the kind of major accords, but what politically should we be looking for about what will happen next within this dynamic, this relationship between Australia and China?
Well, I think it's, the Chinese are also thinking about this at the moment, whether they should really pursue, whether it's worth their while to pursue a better relationship with Australia. And it's not just in Australia that we're debating this. And of course, we're going to take the temperature of that with the AUKUS announcement. I mean, my general point would be, Amy said that the CCP is a learning and adaptive organisation. I think that is true. It's one of their strengths. I hope we are as well, actually, because, we've made mistakes in the way we've pursued our own reset. And we require discipline, a huge amount of investment, careful language, which, as Justin said, can both, get the narrative right, but also, leave as many options open as we've got. Southeast Asia, if we are in Southeast Asia just talking about the China problem, we are going nowhere in Southeast Asia. The same goes with the Pacific. We should be sophisticated enough to compete head on with China in the Pacific, as we are, and we might have to keep doing, and also maintain a dialogue with them. So I just think that we've got to have a robust, but a more sophisticatedly robust approach to this. And just finally, I still am not sure that Australians really understand that the depth of what we are committing to and what it will cost. And that's going to be a big struggle in the years ahead.
Thanks, Richard. And by the way, on the Southeast Asia and the angle one, just because I want to cheerlead everyone who's on here, if you haven't read Richard's piece that came out earlier this week about Australia's big game talk, but underinvestment into Southeast Asia, it's well worth your time to read. I believe it was in AFR, if that's correct. Did I get that
That's right?
Okay.
Thank you.
But Justin, again, you get the final word here, but I want to note that Richard is in some ways teed you up about that discussion for social license on larger commitment of resource allocation, right, to the defense budget. Yes, we've heard in this conversation AUKUS, we've heard DSR, but we also have to talk about the budget, which will be out in May. So again, what things are you looking for over the couple of months ahead?
I really like Richard's phrase of sophisticatedly robust. I think I'll have to try and steal that as well. I'm a big believer in narrative, Charlie. I don't think that we can, when you're talking about AUKUS, DSR, and the combination with the budget, which the Prime Minister Albanese said this week would have increased defence spending. I don't think that we can enhance our capabilities while being silent about it. And I know it's an awful balance because, of course, our region, as diverse as it is, doesn't like it when we talk about military capabilities, but we have to be able to explain why we're going down these particular paths. I actually, I agree with Amy, despite her view that she is a pessimist. I would like, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I would almost like her to be right, because if Amy is right, that there'll always be tensions and that things will get, there'll be bumps in the road. It means, in my view, that the Australian government and the US government are doing things right. I think the reverse is the bigger problem, that if we get to such a view of stabilised relations, that we are not making the decisions that make Beijing upset, then we're going to have even bigger problems, because there'll always be, as we've discussed, there'll always be that next issue. But the narrative is going to be vital. And it goes, it's not just in relation to AUKUS. We've got to ensure, Charlie, that we don't want a situation where we enable Beijing to say, well, we will stop our trade measures against you if you drop the WTO case. We can't have a situation where they say, we will give you back Dr. Young, we'll give you back your Australian arbitrarily detained citizen if we begin negotiations into the TPP. That isn't stable relations. That's coercion. That's an aggressive power having its way. So those are the things that we need. So we need to be able to have these conversations and understand why we are doing things. And the Australian public deserve a level of transparency. It doesn't go into classified information or give up the IP in the nuclear propelled submarines, but provides an understanding of why national security decisions are being made.
Okay, now I'm off mute, but let me kind of wrap this. We're a little bit over the hour, just with an extraordinary thanks to our panelists from beaming in from Melbourne, from Canberra, from Sydney. It's early and it's appreciated. And as all of you know, and as I specifically asked Amy, Australia-China relations are a topic that's actually of some interest here in Washington, and for the fledgling community of Australia watchers here in DC. This has been a really useful conversation. As we noted, it moves across the waterline, just so many different issues here. So again, thank you very much to our panelists. For those who are watching, please make sure that you are tuning in to all these thinkers. They're writing at their home institutions, who put out a lot of work in this space. And then, of course, I really want to thank the CSIS team for putting this up, AV team, Lam and Kevin for putting this all together. And at this point, mates down under, thank you. We'll continue this conversation, I'm sure. And until next time, good night, good morning.
Thank you.